I never thought I'd see my home reduced to a pile of rubble-splintered wood, shattered glass, and the faint smell of dust still hanging in the air. That house wasn't just four walls and a roof. It was years of sweat memories, and the only place my family truly called ours. And yet one woman decided it was in the way. Her name Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA, with a clipboard clutched like a royal scepter and a smile sharp enough to cut steel. She claimed it was all for her new project, some grand clubhouse nobody asked for. But she made one fatal mistake. She forgot whose home she bulldozed. Because when you strip a man of everything, you leave him with nothing to lose. And that's when the fight begins. Before we dive into how Karen went from swinging her weight around to wearing orange behind bars, I've got one request. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's see how far this HOA drama travels. When I first set eyes on the property, it didn't look like much. A faded little house with peeling paint, a cracked driveway, and a roof that sagged like an old man's shoulders. But to me, it wasn't just a house. It was potential. It was a blank canvas. And more importantly, it was a chance to give my family a place that was truly ours, free from the constant noise and nonsense of the city. I spent months fixing it up piece by piece. Every nail hammered, every board replaced, every brushstroke of paint, it was all done with my own two hands. My wife thought I was crazy when I said I could get it back into shape without hiring contractors. You're middle-aged, not 25, she reminded me. But stubbornness is one of my many flaws, and when I set my mind on something, I'll break my back before I quit. By the end of that first summer, the house had transformed. The yard was green, the porch was sturdy, and the kitchen finally had that farmhouse table we'd always dreamed of. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't modern, but it was ours. And that word meant more to me than granite countertops or designer furniture ever could. The neighborhood itself seemed at first like the cherry on top. Rows of tidy lawns, kids on bicycles, retirees waving from their porches. It was the picture of suburban peace. I thought I'd stumbled into a small slice of paradise where neighbors actually cared about one another. That was before I met the dragon that guarded the gates, the HOA president, Karen. Now, if you've ever dealt with an HOA before, you already know the type. Clipboard in hand, always patrolling the streets like she's leading a military unit obsessed with rules that nobody else cares about. Grass too long by an inch, expect a letter. Holiday decorations up one day past New Year's, another fine. Park your truck slightly crooked in your own driveway. Don't worry, she's got a complaint ready. But even in those early days, I thought I can handle this. I had heard horror stories about HOAs, but I figured as long as I kept my head down, paid the fees, and kept my yard neat, I'd be fine. And for a while it seemed like maybe that was true. Karen would glare at me from across the street, scribble notes furiously on her pad, but she never had much to latch on to. That didn't mean she liked me. I could see it in her eyes whenever we crossed paths. There was something about me she didn't trust. Maybe it was that I didn't bend the knee like the other neighbors. Most of them treated her like royalty, nodding nervously whenever she barked out orders at the monthly meetings. I, on the other hand, treated her like any other neighbor, polite but not deferential. I think that bothered her more than if I'd openly insulted her. And then there was my home itself. I didn't realize it at first, but Karen had big plans for the neighborhood. She called it her legacy project, a sprawling community center with a gym pool parking lot and modern design upgrades that she promised would elevate property values. It sounded innocent enough until you realized she was practically foaming at the mouth every time she talked about it. What she failed to mention was that she had already started eyeing which lots would be repurposed. Guess whose house sat right on the corner of her dream project? Yep, mine. Still, back then I was blissfully unaware. I'd come home from work, sit on the porch with a cold beer, and watch the sun dip behind the rooftops. My wife and I hosted barbecues. My kids chased fireflies in the yard. For a while, life was simple, peaceful, exactly what I'd worked for. But paradise has cracks. And when you live in a neighborhood ruled by a Karen, those cracks start to widen fast. The first sign came during a so-called community meeting. Karen strutted in wearing her red blazer like she was running for president of the United States. She clicked her pen 3 times, scanned the room like a general, surveying her troops, and launched into a slideshow presentation about the future of our community. She showed glossy mock-ups of a gleaming clubhouse with glass walls, a pool sparkling like the cover of a magazine, and wide parking spaces lined with flower beds. Neighbors oohed and ahed, some even clapped. I just sat there, arms crossed, waiting to hear the catch. And then it came. "This will require some adjustments," she said, with a sly smile. "Certain lots are positioned in a way that blocks progress. But for the greater good, sacrifices must be made." I didn't know it at the time, but those words were the opening salvo in the war she was about to start. Because my dream home, the one I had poured sweat and years into, was sitting right in the crosshairs of her ambition. And Karen, she wasn't the type to take no for an answer. The moment Karen unveiled her so-called revitalization project, I knew it was trouble. But I didn't realize just how deep the trouble would run until I saw the gleam in her eyes that night. It wasn't the gleam of someone who wanted to serve the community, it was the gleam of someone who wanted to own it. She stood there in the HOA clubhouse, pacing in front of the projector screen, red blazer, flaring every time she spun on her heel. The slides showed glossy pictures of things no one had ever asked for: a sleek two-story clubhouse, a gated pool, tennis courts, even a massive parking lot. Her voice carried through the room with the tone of a preacher giving a sermon. "This project," she said, raising her hand for dramatic effect, "will raise all of our property values by at least 20%. Imagine the pride we'll feel knowing our community is the most desirable neighborhood in the county. This is our chance to shine." The neighbors clapped nervously. Some looked genuinely impressed, others just didn't want to be the one who didn't clap. That's the thing about Karen, she thrived on fear, on silence, on the weight of her clipboard. People would rather nod and agree than risk becoming her next target. I sat in the back row, arms crossed. My wife leaned toward me and whispered, "Don't say anything." She knew me too well. I had that itch, the one I get whenever I smell nonsense. And Karen's project reeked of it. Still, I bit my tongue until she pulled up the map. "This," she announced, clicking her slide to reveal a blueprint of the neighborhood, "is where the new clubhouse will sit. And this," she jabbed her pen right into the spot where my house stood, "is the most logical location for the parking lot. Convenient, central, accessible, perfect." My jaw tightened. My wife squeezed my hand silently, begging me to let it go. But come on, she had just drawn a red X right over our home like it was some disposable monopoly property. So naturally I raised my hand. "Excuse me, Karen," I said, keeping my voice as calm as possible. "You do realize that's my house you're talking about paving over, right? Unless you plan on moving my family into the broom closet of that clubhouse, I don't see how this is going to work." The room went still. You could practically hear the collective gasp of 50 people who all knew better than to interrupt Queen Karen's monologues. Karen turned slowly, her smile thin as a razor blade. "Mr. Henderson," she said in that sickly sweet tone she used when she was about to bite your head off. "Nobody is being forced out. This is just a preliminary proposal. Nothing is final." "Preliminary?" I asked, leaning forward. "Then why is my house already marked for demolition in your slides?" A few neighbors chuckled nervously, but most avoided eye contact. That's how it always went. Let Karen and the loud guy duke it out, while everyone else sank deeper into their folding chairs. Karen's smile never faltered. Change requires vision. Sometimes that vision is difficult for certain individuals to accept. But as HOA president, it's my duty to think of the greater good. There it was. The magic phrase, the greater good. Every HOA tyrant's favorite weapon? Translated into plain English, and it really meant, you're about to get steamrolled, and I'm going to act like it's for your benefit. I opened my mouth to fire back, but my wife tugged on my sleeve hard enough to nearly dislocate my arm. She whispered, "Don't. Not here. Not now." So I swallowed my anger and sat back, though I could feel Karen's smug grin burning into me like a spotlight. The meeting continued with Karen droning on about budgets, timelines, and her strategic partnerships. Every buzzword you can imagine was flying out of her mouth. Revitalization, enhancement, future-proofing. She even said synergy like this was some Silicon Valley startup instead of a sleepy suburban neighborhood. But as I listened, something gnawed at me. She wasn't just spitballing ideas, she already had contractors lined up. She talked about permits being in process. She even mentioned preliminary agreements. This wasn't a dream, it was a plan, and my house was right at the center of it. After the meeting, Karen cornered me by the coffee table. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were cold. "Mr. Henderson," she said, lowering her voice, "I hope you'll come around. Change is never easy, but trust me, you'll thank me later." "Trust you," I said. "You just tried to bulldoze my home on a PowerPoint slide." Her smile sharpened. "Homes can be rebuilt. Communities can't." Then she patted my shoulder like I was a stubborn child, refusing to eat broccoli, and walked away. That was the moment I realized Karen wasn't just power-hungry, she was dangerous. She had convinced herself she was untouchable, that whatever she declared was law. And the worst part, most of the neighborhood seemed too afraid or too apathetic to stop her. Over the next few weeks, the signs multiplied. Letters from the HOA about long-term improvements. Notices about potential special assessments to fund the project. Karen strutting around the neighborhood with contractors in tow, pointing at lots like a general planning a battlefield. And then came the kicker, a formal letter addressed to me informing me that my property was being evaluated for repurposing. That was the word she used, repurposing. Like my home was a soda can being recycled instead of the place where I tucked my kids into bed every night. I crumpled the letter in my fist. That was the first time I said it out loud, the words that would become my mantra over my dead body. Karen thought she could turn my life into a line item on her clipboard. But I had news for her, she picked the wrong man to pave over. The first letter showed up 3 days after that meeting. It was stuffed into my mailbox like a scarlet warning flag. Bold letters across the top screamed, "Notice of violation." Now mind you, I had read our HOA covenant. Painful as it was, I forced myself through that 50-page monstrosity when we first moved in. And I knew for a fact that what they were accusing me of, excessive lawn growth exceeding 2.5 inches, was complete garbage. I'd mowed the yard 2 days prior. The grass was so short a golf ball would have rolled across it like glass. Still there, it was in black and white. And at the bottom, in Karen's elegant but menacing handwriting, failure to address this violation may result in fines, liens, or further enforcement. My wife laughed when I showed her. She's just testing you. Ignore it. I wanted to laugh too, but I knew better. Karen didn't do tests. Karen did campaigns. And this was her opening move. The second letter came a week later, unapproved exterior modifications. What modification? According to the notice, the new mailbox I'd installed, replacing the rusted hunk of metal the old owner left behind, was not architecturally harmonious with the neighborhood aesthetic. The mailbox. A black standard-issue Home Depot mailbox. Apparently harmony required me to go buy the exact brand Karen's committee favored. Another fine threatened. By the third notice, improper vehicle storage, I stopped laughing altogether. Karen had cited me because my son's beat-up Toyota pickup sat in our driveway overnight. Heaven forbid a working-class vehicle soil her perfect suburban streets. It was obvious she was building a case, piling violations on top of each other until she had enough ammunition to justify whatever came next. And she didn't stop at letters. One Saturday morning, I woke up to find 2 men in matching polo shirts walking the perimeter of my property. Clipboards in hand, sunglasses on, snapping pictures of my gutters, my fence, even my garbage cans. They looked like low-rent private investigators. I stepped outside in my bathrobe and shouted, "Can I help you, gentlemen? HOA inspection," one of them said flatly, as if that explained everything. "Funny," I replied. "I don't remember inviting you onto my property." "We have authorization from the board," the other said. "Oh yeah, show me." They glanced at each other, muttered something about being late, and scurried off down the street like raccoons caught raiding trash cans. That was the first time I saw Karen watching from across the road, arms folded, lips pursed into that smug little smirk. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. Just stood there drinking in my frustration like it was champagne. The petty harassment didn't stop there. One afternoon, I came home to find a bright orange sticker slapped across my garage door, "Pending review." Non-compliant structure. No explanation, just the kind of label you'd expect on a condemned building. My neighbors peeked through their curtains whispering like I was some criminal under investigation. That's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just trying to annoy me. She was isolating me, turning me into the neighborhood outcast, so that when she finally made her move to take my property, nobody would come to my defense. And honestly, it was working. People I used to chat with on the sidewalk suddenly avoided eye contact. Neighbors who once borrowed my tools now crossed the street when they saw me coming. At the grocery store, I overheard someone mutter, "He's the one fighting Karen," like I was some kind of disease. My wife tried to keep my spirits up. "It's just intimidation," she said. "Bullies always push hardest right before they break," but I wasn't sure Karen could break. She had the whole board eating out of her hand, and she wielded those HOA rules like weapons forged in a courtroom. Every letter, every sticker, every clipboard inspection was another bullet fired in her war. Then came the knock at the door. It was late after 10 p.m., and my first thought was it must be an emergency. I opened the door to find a man in a cheap suit holding a stack of papers. "You've been served," he said, thrusting them into my chest before walking away. I flipped through the pages under the porch light. Karen had officially filed a motion with the HOA board to declare my property a nuisance and subject to removal under community improvement bylaws. Translated, she was laying the groundwork to bulldoze my home. I stood there on the porch papers, trembling in my hands, rage bubbling in my chest. She wasn't just threatening me anymore, she was preparing to erase me. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table staring at those papers until the sun came up, a pot of coffee going cold beside me. I kept hearing her voice from that meeting. Sacrifices must be made for the greater good. Well, if Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one. Because I may be middle-aged, I may be stubborn, and I may have lost a few battles to gray hair and creaky knees, but when you threaten my family, my home, and everything I've worked for, I fight back. She thought the letters, the stickers, the threats would scare me into surrender, but all they did was light a fire I didn't know I still had, and I was about to show her exactly what happens when you push the wrong man too far. I'll never forget the sound. It was a low guttural rumble that shook the pavement beneath my feet like thunder rolling in the distance. At first I thought it was a storm, but when I turned the corner onto my street, I realized it wasn't the sky, it was the ground. Bulldozers, excavators, engines growling like hungry beasts. And then I saw it. My home was being torn apart before my eyes. The porch where my wife and I sipped coffee every morning reduced to splinters. The living room window where my kids taped their school drawings, shattered. The roof I'd patched with my own hands last summer, collapsing into a cloud of dust. For a moment, I froze. My brain refused to process what my eyes were screaming. This couldn't be real. Houses don't just vanish in broad daylight. There had to be some mistake. But then I spotted her, Karen standing tall at the edge of the lot, clipboard in hand, like a conductor leading a twisted orchestra. She wore sunglasses, though the sky was overcast, and her smile stretched so wide it made my stomach turn. She didn't even flinch as the machines ripped through wood and concrete, as if watching my life crumble was just another item on her to-do list. I stormed forward, dust stinging my throat. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted over the roar of the engines. Karen turned, tilting her head with that smug calmness she'd perfected. "Mr. Henderson," she said, voice syrupy, sweet, "this is for the greater good. Your property has been repurposed under community bylaws. We tried to reach a compromise, but you left us no choice." "No choice," I barked. "You're demolishing my house. My family lives here. Everything I own is inside that building." She adjusted her sunglasses and gestured toward the paperwork clutched to her chest. "All proper approvals have been filed. You'll be reimbursed accordingly." Reimbursed. As if a check could buy back a lifetime of sweat, laughter, and memories. As if a number on a page could replace my kids' bedrooms, my wife's garden, my late father's workbench in the garage. I lunged toward the bulldozer, waving my arms. "Shut it down. Stop this right now." The operator shook his head, eyes full of pity. "Sorry, sir. Orders are orders." And the machine groaned forward, tearing another chunk from my home. Neighbors stood at the edges of their lawns, whispering, filming with their phones. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody spoke up. It was as if my entire world was collapsing in front of a silent audience, too afraid to challenge the tyrant with the clipboard. Karen leaned closer to me, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "You should have listened. Resistance is exhausting, isn't it? Maybe now you'll learn it's easier to comply." Her words dripped like acid. I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body, screaming to swing at that smug smile. But what good would that do? She had the board, the bylaws, the heavy machinery. All I had left was anger, and anger wouldn't stop the wrecking ball. By sunset it was over. My house wasn't a house anymore. It was a heap of broken lumber and twisted metal. Dust coated my hair, my clothes, my skin. I stood in the wreckage numb, while Karen strutted away like she'd just won a trophy. That night, my family and I huddled in a cheap motel room on the edge of town. My kids cried themselves to sleep. My wife stared at the ceiling, silent tears sliding down her cheeks. I sat in the corner, papers spread across the floor, trying to make sense of what had happened. But one truth burned through the haze: Karen had gone too far. Destroying my house wasn't just another HOA power play. It wasn't a fine, a sticker, or an orange violation notice. It was war. And if she thought she could bury me under the rubble of my own home, she had another thing coming. I looked at my reflection in the motel window, the faint glow of the streetlights casting shadows across my face. "She thinks this is the end," I whispered to myself. But this is only the beginning. Because here's the thing about demolishing a man's home: you don't just knock down walls and rip apart lumber. You ignite something deeper, a fury that doesn't fade, a resolve that hardens with every breath. Karen thought she had won. She thought the sight of bulldozers and rubble would break me. But all she did was give me a reason to fight harder than I ever had in my life. And I was about to make sure the world saw exactly what happens when a Karen pushes the wrong homeowner too far. The morning after the demolition, I woke up in that cramped motel room with a pounding headache and a knot in my chest. My wife tried to keep the kids distracted with cartoons on the flickering TV, but the silence between us was heavier than bricks. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt hollow, like Karen had scooped out the very center of my life with her bulldozers. But grief has a way of turning into something sharper when you've got nowhere else to go. By the second cup of bitter motel coffee, the hollow feeling hardened into resolve. Karen had stolen my home, but she wasn't going to steal my dignity, not without a fight. The first step was simple. I needed to know how she pulled this off. HOA bylaws or not, there was no way one woman could just order a demolition like she was swatting a fly. There had to be paperwork, permits, contracts, something. And if there was something, I'd find it. So I drove down to the county records office, a bland government building that smelled like old paper and disinfectant. The clerk behind the counter looked at me like I was crazy when I asked for demolition permits connected to my address. She tapped away on her computer, frowned, and then disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she dropped a manila folder onto the counter. Inside was the so-called authorization Karen had used to greenlight the demolition. My eyes scanned the pages, heart hammering. The signatures looked official at first glance, but something was off. My name was on the consent line, only I'd never signed anything. Someone had forged it. That was my first piece of ammunition. I spent the rest of the week buried in paperwork. County zoning maps, HOA meeting, minutes, contractor invoices. I didn't just find smoke, I found a raging fire. Karen hadn't just bent the rules. She'd snapped them in half and set them on fire. For starters, she'd funneled HOA dues into a private community development account with no oversight. From there, the money flowed into all sorts of consulting fees and planning expenses, most of which conveniently linked back to companies run by her relatives. One invoice was literally signed by her cousin, who ran a landscaping business that hadn't mowed a single blade of grass in our neighborhood. Then there were the contractors. The demolition crew that leveled my house. Turns out Karen had promised them a fast-track payment if they didn't ask too many questions. They hadn't even seen the full permits, just a single-page authorization with her signature and a stamp that looked suspiciously photocopied. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. She had been running this HOA like her personal empire for years, stacking the board with her allies, silencing dissent with fines and skimming off the top every chance she got. Most neighbors never noticed because they were too busy or too scared to ask questions. But now, with my house in ruins, I had nothing left to lose, and all the time in the world to dig. Word started to spread quietly. A retired neighbor stopped me at the gas station whispering. She threatened to fine me $5,000 for painting my shutters the wrong shade of blue. I didn't fight it because I was afraid. Another told me Karen had forced her to tear down a perfectly good deck, claiming it violated design standards. She'd paid a contractor recommended by Karen, who just so happened to be another cousin. The stories poured in like confessions at a church. Everyone had been bullied, squeezed, or humiliated, but nobody had ever stood up to her, not until now. I started organizing my findings, building a timeline. Every forged signature, every shady invoice, every threat she'd issued. It was a mountain of evidence, and I was going to make sure it didn't just collect dust. Of course, Karen caught wind of my little investigation. One evening I pulled into the motel parking lot and found her waiting by my truck, arms folded, clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. "You're wasting your time," she said before I even spoke. "These people love their community. They love me. You're just a bitter man without a home." I stepped closer, close enough to see the cracks in her perfect facade. "Funny," I said, holding up a photocopy of the forged permit, "because this piece of paper says otherwise." For the first time, her smile faltered. Only for a second, but it was enough. She snatched the paper from my hand, crumpled it, and tossed it back at me. "You think anyone will believe you? I am the HOA." She walked off into the night, but that slip, that tiny crack in her armor, told me everything I needed to know. She was scared. And fear makes people sloppy. That's when I knew the tide was turning. I wasn't just the angry homeowner shouting into the wind anymore. I was building a case. Piece by piece, document by document, witness by witness. And when I was ready, I'd drag every rotten secret Karen had buried right into the light of day. She thought she'd destroyed me by knocking down my house. But in reality, she'd done the opposite. She'd built me into her worst nightmare, a man with nothing left to lose, armed with the truth. And the truth, unlike houses, can't be bulldozed. You can only push a man so far before he starts pushing back. And Karen had pushed me past the point of no return. By the time I finished gathering my mountain of evidence, fake permits, shady contracts, neighbors' testimonies, I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. Karen had her claws deep in the HOA board, and the board had the power to dismiss any complaint I filed. I needed someone who could take the fight to a higher level. So I hired a lawyer. Not just any lawyer either. I found a sharp, ruthless attorney named Collins, who had the kind of reputation that made crooked HOA boards sweat bullets. He specialized in property law fraud cases, and most importantly, he had zero patience for bullies. When I slid the stack of documents across his desk, Collins whistled low. "Mr. Henderson," he said, flipping through the forged permits, "this isn't just a case. This is a buffet. Fraud, misappropriation of funds, forgery, abuse of power. I could dine out on this for months." "Then let's eat," I told him. The first salvo came in the form of a lawsuit. Collins drafted it with surgical precision, naming Karen personally, along with the HOA, as co-defendants. We filed for damages related to the unlawful demolition of my home, fraud, emotional distress, and about 6 other charges that made my head spin. It was a legal battering ram aimed straight at her clipboard fortress. Word spread fast. The neighborhood, which had been eerily silent since the demolition, suddenly buzzed with whispers. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Karen strutted in as usual, red blazer flashing like a warning light, but there was a stiffness in her walk I hadn't seen before. I sat near the front, Collins by my side, briefcase planted firmly on the table like a weapon. When Karen opened her mouth to launch into her usual spiel about community improvement, Collins stood and cleared his throat. "Madam President," he said, his voice crisp, "my client has a pending lawsuit against both you and this board. Before you proceed with tonight's agenda, we need to make it clear that anything you say may be entered into discovery." You could have heard a pin drop. Karen's eyes narrowed, her smile twitching at the edges. "This meeting," she said, her voice faltering just a little, "is not the place to discuss frivolous litigation." Frivolous, Collins chuckled. "I wouldn't call forgery and embezzlement frivolous, but the judge will have the final word, won't he?" Gasps rippled through the room. Neighbors glanced at each other, whispering nervously. A few of them, finally emboldened, looked at Karen with something other than blind obedience. Doubt. Karen tried to plow ahead with the meeting, but the damage was done. For the first time, she wasn't untouchable. For the first time, the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats instead of nodding like bobbleheads. And that was just the beginning. The subpoenas went out next. Every invoice, every check, every board email dragged into the light of discovery. Collins uncovered a paper trail so sloppy it was almost insulting. Karen had used HOA funds to pay for personal spa trips, luxury handbags, and even a Caribbean vacation. She had signed contracts with relatives' businesses that never performed the work. She had lost thousands of dollars in untraceable administrative costs. When Collins laid it all out on his office table, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "She wasn't just corrupt," I said. "She was lazy about it." Arrogant, Collins corrected. "She thought nobody would ever challenge her." That's the problem with bullies, they start believing their own lies. As the legal noose tightened, Karen grew desperate. She started knocking on neighbors' doors trying to rally support. She told them I was suing them, that if I won, their dues would skyrocket, their homes would lose value. Some believed her, but more and more began to see through the cracks. The woman who once inspired fear now looked frantic, sweaty, cornered. At one point, she even tried to confront me directly. I was at the grocery store picking up milk when she appeared at the end of the aisle, red blazer flashing like a matador's cape. "You think you can beat me?" she hissed, blocking my path. "I am this neighborhood. Without me, everything falls apart." I leaned on my cart and stared her down. "Funny," I said, "because from where I'm standing it looks like everything's falling apart because of you." Her face turned crimson. She spun on her heel and stormed out, nearly knocking over a display of cereal boxes. That's when I knew I had her rattled. The next HOA meeting was chaos. Neighbors showed up with their own stories, emboldened by the lawsuit. One elderly man stood up and shouted, "You fined me $300 for leaving my trash bin out for 10 minutes. Another neighbor accused her of threatening foreclosure over a misplaced garden gnome. The room erupted into shouting, and Karen's gavel did nothing to restore order. I didn't even have to speak. The tide had turned. The same people who once whispered in fear were now raising their voices against her. When I walked out of that meeting, I could feel the shift in the air. The power dynamic had cracked. Karen wasn't the queen anymore. She was just another defendant waiting to face judgment. And for the first time, since my house was reduced to rubble, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel in weeks' hope. The courthouse smelled of old wood and nerves. I'd never been much for drama, but that morning I felt like I was stepping onto a stage. Only this time the audience wasn't neighbors peeking through blinds. It was a judge in a black robe, a jury box half filled with locals, and a gallery buzzing with reporters who'd caught wind of the HOA scandal. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Collins, my lawyer who looked calm as a surgeon before an operation. Across from us sat Karen in her trademark red blazer lips painted into a defiant smile, flanked by a jittery lawyer who already looked like he wanted to crawl under the desk. The bailiff barked for order and the trial began. Collins didn't waste time. He rose from his chair, walked to the jury, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case about community improvement. This is a case about power-abused laws broken and a homeowner's life destroyed by one woman who thought rules were for everyone but herself." Karen rolled her eyes and scribbled furiously on her legal pad. Then her lawyer stood stammering about how my home had been voluntarily surrendered for redevelopment and that I was simply disgruntled. I nearly laughed out loud. Voluntarily surrendered, maybe in the same way a bank robber voluntarily surrenders your wallet. The first witness was a county clerk who testified that the demolition permit for my property contained a forged signature, my signature. Collins held it up to the courtroom like it was Exhibit A in a murder trial. "Mr. Henderson, did you sign this?" I leaned into the microphone. "No, sir. I've never seen that document in my life. Whoever signed it was lying." Karen's lawyer tried to object, but the judge waved him off. The jurors leaned forward, some whispering to each other. Next came the financial records. Collins called in an auditor who explained how HOA dues had been siphoned into a mysterious account. On the projector screen, page after page of expenses flashed: spa trips, handbags, vacations, all labeled as community enrichment. The jury chuckled bitterly. Even the judge raised his eyebrows. Karen sat stone-faced, though I noticed her hands trembling as she clutched her pen. Then came the neighbors. One by one, they stood in the witness box and recounted years of harassment. The elderly man with the trash bin fine. The young couple threatened with foreclosure over Christmas lights. A mother whose child's swing set had been deemed non-compliant and torn down without notice. Each testimony painted the same picture: a woman who ruled with intimidation, who treated the HOA like her personal kingdom. Finally, Collins dropped the hammer. He pulled out a contract between the HOA and a landscaping company owned by Karen's cousin. "Can you tell us," Collins asked the contractor on the stand, "how many times your company actually serviced this neighborhood?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "None. None," Collins repeated, his voice echoing. "None. We were paid, but we didn't do the work." Karen said it was easier that way. The courtroom gasped. Karen's lawyer buried his face in his hands. When Karen herself took the stand, she tried to summon her old bravado. She insisted everything she did was for the community, that she had broad discretion as HOA president, that my demolition was an unfortunate misunderstanding. But Collins dismantled her word by word. He pressed on the forged signature, the missing funds, the sham contracts. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Whitaker," he loved, using her full name, "that you personally benefited from funds meant for this community?" Karen stammered, I approved expenses necessary for leadership morale." "Leadership morale?" Collins raised an eyebrow. "A Caribbean vacation is necessary for leadership morale." The jury laughed outright. Even the judge shook his head. By the time Collins was done, Karen wasn't the HOA queen anymore. She was just a cornered liar in a red blazer, drowning under the weight of her own arrogance. I'll admit, I felt a certain grim satisfaction watching her unravel, but there was also something sad about it. Here was a woman who could have been a decent leader, who could have made real improvements. Instead, she chose greed and control, and now she was watching it all crumble in front of her. When the closing arguments wrapped up, the jury barely needed an hour. They returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on fraud, embezzlement, and unlawful demolition. The judge's gavel came down with a crack that echoed like thunder. Karen's face finally cracked. For the first time in all the months I'd known her, she looked small, weak. As deputies placed her in handcuffs, she shot me one last glare, half fury, half disbelief. I didn't say a word. I just watched, as the woman who destroyed my home was led out of the courtroom, her clipboard empire collapsing behind her. And for the first time since the bulldozers rolled in, I could finally breathe. The day Karen was sentenced, the courthouse was packed. Not just with lawyers and reporters, but with my neighbors, people who for months had whispered from behind curtains, too afraid to stand against her. Now they were here, shoulder to shoulder, waiting to see the queen of the HOA stripped of her crown. I'll never forget the sound of the judge's voice. Calm, steady, merciless. "Mrs. Whitaker, you stand convicted of fraud, embezzlement, and unlawful destruction of private property. This court sentences you to 5 years in state prison with restitution to be paid to the plaintiff." 5 years. The words hung in the air like a church bell. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt my chest loosen. Justice wasn't just a dream anymore, it was real, tangible, ringing out for everyone to hear. Karen, however, didn't take it with grace. She leapt from her chair, face red, voice shrill. "This is a mistake. I am the HOA. You can't do this to me." The deputies grabbed her arms as she kicked and screamed, her clipboard clattering to the floor. I swear that sound plastic snapping against the tile was sweeter than any symphony. She shouted all the way out of the courtroom, but nobody rushed to defend her. The same neighbors who once bowed their heads in obedience now looked at her with disgust. Some even smirked. The spell was broken. As I walked out of the courthouse, I was met with nods, handshakes, even hugs. The elderly man who'd been fined over his trash bin shook my hand firmly. "You did what none of us could," he said, his eyes watery. A mother pulled me aside to thank me for standing up when her family couldn't. Even those who had once avoided me now looked me in the eye, their silence replaced by gratitude. It was surreal. For months I'd been the pariah, the troublemaker, the man standing alone against the HOA machine. And now I was something else entirely. Not a hero maybe, but proof that even one voice can shatter a bully's illusion of power. The news spread fast. Local papers ran headlines about the HOA tyrant jailed for fraud. The evening news replayed footage of Karen being led away in cuffs. My phone buzzed with messages from distant friends and family who'd seen the story online. But the best part came when I drove back through the neighborhood. For the first time in months, people waved again. Kids rode bikes freely without fear of being cited for unsafe play. Lawns blossomed with flowers Karen would have called non-compliant. The place actually felt alive. The HOA board, stripped of its figurehead, scrambled to rebuild. Emergency elections were held. This time, neighbors actually stepped up, people who cared about community instead of control. Transparency was promised. Budgets were opened. The bylaws were reviewed line by line, with everyone invited to contribute. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And it was a reminder that power only works when people surrender to it. Once Karen's grip loosened, the neighborhood found its voice again. As for me, I finally got a settlement check restitution for the demolition of my home. It didn't erase the pain of losing the place I'd built with my own hands, but it gave me the chance to start again. My wife and I found a new lot just outside the neighborhood, where HOA signs dared not tread. It wasn't the same house, but when the foundation was poured, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Sometimes at night I still think about Karen, not out of pity but out of astonishment. She really believed she was untouchable. She thought a clipboard and a title gave her more power than decency, more permanence than the law. But in the end, the gavel came down harder than any HOA rule ever could. The last image I have of her is burned into my mind: Karen in her red blazer, wrists cuffed, being shoved into the back of a police car while neighbors snapped photos. The same people who once bowed to her now watched her fall with satisfaction. And me, I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I just stood there quietly, breathing in the air of freedom, knowing the fight was finally over. Karen had demolished my house, but in the end, she demolished herself. When the dust finally settled, literally and figuratively, I was standing at the edge of an empty lot, staring at what used to be my life. The rubble had been cleared, the machines long gone, and all that remained was a bare patch of earth where my home once stood. It should have felt like defeat, but oddly, it felt like possibility. The settlement money wasn't enough to make me rich, but it was enough to start again. My wife and I had a long talk sitting in that motel room one last time before we checked out. "Do we rebuild here?" she asked. "Or do we start somewhere new?" I looked at her, at my kids curled up asleep in the bed, and I realized the answer wasn't about a house or a street, it was about us. Home isn't walls, it's the people inside them. We found a plot of land just outside city limits, away from HOA rules and clipboard tyrants. It was raw, open space with room to breathe. No bylaws dictating the color of shutters, no threats about lawn length, no community projects designed to line someone's pockets. Just freedom. Rebuilding wasn't easy. Every nail I hammered into that new frame felt like a reminder of what Karen had taken, but also a symbol of what she couldn't take. My wife planted a new garden, richer and brighter than before. My kids painted their new rooms however they wanted, blue walls, posters, mess, and all. And for the first time in months, laughter filled our evenings again. Meanwhile, back in the old neighborhood, things were changing too. With Karen gone, the board restructured itself. They opened the books, apologized for their silence, and promised transparency. Neighbors who once whispered in fear now spoke openly. The place wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was no longer under the shadow of a tyrant in a red blazer. One evening, I drove through to see it for myself. I passed by the community clubhouse. Karen had dreamed of still half-built and abandoned weeds pushing through the concrete. It stood as a monument to her arrogance, a reminder that power built on lies will always collapse. A neighbor spotted me and waved. This time I waved back. No bitterness, no anger, just closure. Life has a strange way of circling back. Losing my home was the worst thing that had ever happened to me, but it led me to something better. It forced me to fight to stand tall when it would have been easier to crumble. And it showed my kids what it means to never bow to bullies, no matter how powerful they pretend to be. As I sat on the porch of our new home one evening, beer in hand, watching the sunset stretch across the horizon, I thought back to Karen's words, "Sacrifices must be made for the greater good." She was right in a way. Sacrifices were made, but not mine, hers. She sacrificed her freedom, her reputation, her empire of fear, all because she couldn't see the line between leadership and tyranny. And me, I gained something stronger than a house. I gained my voice. I gained proof that no clipboard, no fine, no bulldozer can erase a man who refuses to stay silent. The story was over, but the lesson would last forever. If there's one thing I learned through this entire ordeal, it's that bullies thrive in silence. They grow strong when good people bite their tongues, when neighbors shrug and say, "It's not my problem." Karen built her empire because nobody stood up to her until I had no choice. Losing my home hurt. It cut me to my core. But it also forced me to stand up not just for myself, but for everyone who had been steamrolled by her clipboard tyranny. And once one person stood, others found the courage to follow. That's the power of resistance. It spreads. Life will always throw bulldozers in your path, sometimes literally, but you can't let them define you. You rebuild, you push back, you fight for what's right even when the odds feel impossible. Because at the end of the day, home isn't just a building. Home is dignity. Home is freedom. Home is the courage to say enough. So here's my question to you. Have you ever faced a Karen in your life, someone who abused their little scrap of power to make your world miserable? Share your story in the comments. Let's hear it. And if you want more tales of HOA drama, revenge, and justice served, don't forget to subscribe. Because trust me, this is far from the last HOA story you'll want to hear.